It's only for
okay. I deliberately put this lecture on this afternoon on the grounds that this morning's was very long and this is somewhat shorter. Moreover, this morning's tells you some of the relevant background. But I think I should also say, I think this is the most difficult paper I have ever written. I mean, the most difficult for me to write. For two reasons. One was that figuring out the legal history of the first case I shall talk about, Oxendine versus Merrill Dow, took months, just months, to figure out what happened, because only parts of the case are reported, and you have to infer what must have happened in the gaps between the reports. Also because what I was trying to do in this paper was to apply my own epistemological theory to a really hard epistemological question that comes up in court over and over. I had no idea how difficult it is to apply your own theory. It's very hard. I actually made a mistake the first time and had to rip up the first version. Okay, so next. This is a quotation from a philosopher of science, 19th century philosopher of science, William Whewell. Not much discussed nowadays. Famous, I'm afraid, primarily because he was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, at the time when Darwin's Origin of Species appeared, and he refused to allow a copy of this book in the college library. So he's notorious as the philosopher of science who wouldn't even allow Darwin's book to enter his terrain. But he's also known for the concept of consilience. This is not a regular English word. This is a word which he coined. Comes from the Latin. It's probably more self-explanatory to you than it is to English-speaking students. Con, together, and ciliare, to jump. Okay, so saute, for example, as in saute potatoes is jumping in the pan. So consilience means jumping together. Okay. Here's what he says about the consilience of inductions. The consilience of induction takes place when an induction obtained from one class of facts coincides with an induction obtained from a different class. This consilience is a test of the truth of the theory in which it occurs. He says very little else about what consilience is, and the word was barely heard again until 1998, when E.O. Wilson published a book called Consilience with the subtitle The Unity of Knowledge. It's now becoming more like a regular English word. The concept is enormously important, though Whewell doesn't do much of a job of explaining it. But he understands a key idea. Bits of evidence sometimes jump together to make you more sure of a conclusion than you would be on the basis of any part of it. Okay. That's why I choose him as a way of entering into this problem. Okay, next. There are two cases, one not very well known and one very well known, where consilience, though nobody used the word, was explicitly an issue in a legal case. Okay. In my opinion, there are thousands of cases where consilience is implicitly an issue. But I've chosen these two because these are the two where the trouble comes to the surface and judges actually discuss the question. Okay, let's start with Oxendine, the next slide. Okay, Oxendine was another Bendectian case, another case involving this morning sickness drug. And Mary Oxendine, interestingly enough, was born with a short right forearm and only 3 fingers on her right hand joined together. Almost exactly the same birth defect as Jason Daubert's which I told you about this morning. Now, in this case, I think I want to tell you a little bit more about this case. This case went on for 18 years before it was finally resolved. Can you imagine being the parents of this poor child, or being this poor child? Over and over, juries would find for the Oxendines and would award them a significant sum of money. Over and over, the verdict would be overturned by judges who thought that it was unreasonable. And this went on for 18 years, which by my lights is just an unconscionable delay. This is just too long. Right? It's just too long. If you wait that long, even if they were compensated, they would already have been damaged beyond the original damage. But anyway, set that aside. The interesting evidentiary thing about Oxendine is that the plaintiffs offered a whole bunch of different bits of evidence. There was evidence about what happened when you fed bendectin to pregnant rabbits, for example. There were animal studies. There was evidence about what happened when you exposed cells in a test tube to the active ingredients in this drug, and what did they do? There were epidemiological studies reanalyzed by the plaintiff's experts. Let me explain what this means. There were statistical studies conducted by the manufacturers of the drug, which, predictably enough, showed that the drug was harmless. It did not cause birth defects. But one of the Oxendine's experts reanalyzed these studies by taking out of them all the Canadian women. Why? Because in Canada, but not in the US, it was possible to obtain bendectin without a prescription. So that you couldn't be sure how many of the Canadian women in the study had actually taken the drug, because you didn't have, as you did with the American women, a record of the doctor prescribing it. Okay. And when he took the Canadian women out of the study, it seemed to show a significantly increased risk of birth defects in the offspring of women who took bendectin. Okay. Now, the plaintiffs never said that any one of these pieces of evidence would prove that what caused Mary Oxendine's birth defect was her mother's taking this drug. They always said, no, none of these by itself is enough. But if you put them all together, they make the case to the required standard of proof, that's to say, by a preponderance of the evidence. And at one stage of the trial, Associate Judge Terry actually agreed with them and tried to explain how this could happen. Okay, next. So, here's what Judge Terry has to say at an intermediate stage of this trial. Like the pieces of a mosaic, the individual studies showed little or nothing when viewed separately from one another. But they combined to produce a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. A foundation for Dr. Dunn's opinion that bendectin caused Appellant's birth defects. Okay. He was in due course overruled. In due course, Merrill Dow won. In due course, Merrill Dow won every one of these hundreds of cases brought against it because of this drug. And at the end of the day, I still don't know whether or not bendectin causes birth defects. That's one of the very sad things about this. After hundreds of such cases, hundreds of judges sifting through this evidence, I still would have to say, if you ask me, honestly, I don't know. It's all so confused. What I do know is Merrill Dow had legal resources way beyond the legal resources of any of the plaintiffs, and they simply steamrolled them. Right? And once you've won most of the cases, other judges don't want to be the outliers. Okay, next slide. Now we return to this morning's story for a minute. In 1993, the Supreme Court's ruling in Daubert changed the legal landscape about the admissibility of scientific testimony. Okay. It was another Benedictine case, as those of you who are here this morning know, and the first ever Supreme Court ruling on the admissibility of scientific testimony. Because in Daubert, the Supreme Court said for the first time, when you're assessing whether or not anybody's expert testimony is admissible, you shouldn't look to the conclusions that the expert draws, you should look to the methodology that he uses. I think the idea was that you didn't want to write the law about admissibility in such a way that it was never the case that both sides could produce admissible evidence. And if you ask the judge to look at the conclusions, if he thinks these conclusions are reasonable, he's just going to exclude the other party's evidence automatically. Perhaps I'll say, because I'm conscious that not all of you were here this morning, what it means to say that evidence is admissible. This is a concept much stronger in its consequences in common law systems than in civil law systems. Evidence which is deemed inadmissible by the judge will never be heard by the jury. Right? Or if the jury does hear it accidentally, they will be told to disregard it. Okay. This means that in something like a toxic tort case of the Oxendine type, where everything depends on your scientific testimony, if the judge rules your testimony inadmissible, you have no case, and he will grant summary judgment to the defendant. Okay. What Daubert said was that courts must screen both for the relevance of evidence, okay, fair enough, screen, filter out irrelevant evidence, and filter out unreliable evidence. Okay. And in screening for reliability, the court said, you must look to the methodology and not the conclusions. And that's why after 1993, though never before, people suddenly start talking about weight of evidence methodology. Everybody's got to have a methodology. If you don't have a methodology, you don't have a chance. So everybody uses the word methodology. It becomes ubiquitous for a while. Okay. Now the second case, General Electric versus Joyner. This is a case involving a chemical called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Don't ask me. This is a synthetic chemical. It's a class of synthetic chemicals. It does not occur in nature. It's only made by man. Right? It's very useful for a lot of purposes. For example, it's a very useful addition in insulating oil. It keeps it cool, stops it from getting too hot. It's also extremely toxic. Okay, not PVC, PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls. I conjecture that it's not permitted to be manufactured or used in this country. It has been banned in the United States since 1978 because it's toxic as hell, right? It's really, really toxic. It's great stuff for all sorts of industrial purposes, but if you go anywhere near it, you're likely to get some form or another of cancer. It's deadly stuff, which is why its manufacture and use is no longer allowed. Okay, now Mr. Joyner was an electrician for a city in the state of Georgia. This doesn't mean that he installed plugs and that's not what it meant. It meant that he worked on the big transformers in the city. He would have to go, climb up there, take them apart, clean the bits, and put them back together again. Or if something went wrong with the transformer, he would have to go up, take it apart, fix the bit that was damaged, and put them back together. So he's dealing with big electrical equipment. I'm imagining it as big as this room. It was insulated with oil, which was contaminated with PCBs. Okay. The electrical equipment and the oil were both made by General Electric Company, okay, which owns half the world, but among other things, it makes electrical equipment. Okay. Mr. Joyner had done this for years and years and years, until the city discovered the insulating oil is contaminated with PCBs. So they said to all the electricians, oh look, here are some spacesuits for you, and some big rubber gloves, and great big rubber boots. You shouldn't disassemble the transformers without wearing all this protective gear. Well, what would you think if they did that to you? I'd think, good God, how much damage has it done to me already? I've been doing this for years, in street clothes, maybe wearing gloves, but that's about it. The stuff has got all over me. Okay, well, at the age of 37, which is very young, Mr. Joyner was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer. Terminal, right? There was nothing anyone could do for him. Believing that this had been caused by his work on the transformers, he sued General Electric. And then he shows up in court with a whole bunch of experts who want to testify to various things. You know, you expose rabbits to PCBs and they develop cancer. You expose mice, they develop cancer. You put PCBs into cells in test tubes and they start growing out of control. And there are various epidemiological studies, none of them directly relevant, interestingly enough, because nobody could conduct such a study when you could not in good conscience deliberately expose some people to PCBs to see whether it caused this particular kind of cancer, because it was already known to be so toxic. You see what I mean? So the epidemiological studies were relevant but not immediately and directly relevant. And what they argued was, look, none of these bits of evidence by itself is sufficient. You inject baby mice with PCBs, they develop cancer. But the dose you have to give them is bigger than the dose that we can plausibly argue Mr. Joyner got. And these epidemiological studies show that related kinds of oil cause cancer, and etc., etc. If you put all this together, using weight of evidence methodology, that shows that more likely than not, this was what caused Mr. Joyner's cancer. To which the defendants, the plaintiffs continued. There was another part of their argument, interesting. The methodology that we used, they said, was weight of evidence methodology. The methodology that GE's experts used was exactly the same methodology. They reached a different conclusion, but they used the same methodology. Since the court is only supposed to be looking at the methodology, you can't admit their evidence and exclude ours, because it used the same methodology. Right? To which General Electric's attorneys replied, weight of evidence, my methodology, que basura. What rubbish, right? There is no such thing as weight of evidence methodology. All you're telling me is all you've got is a big pile of weak evidence. Right? Each of these bits of evidence is feeble in the extreme. It's muy débil. It's very, very weak. And what you get if you have a big collection of very weak bits of evidence is a big collection of very weak bits of evidence. But it doesn't, by some kind of epistemological magic trick, become strong by being put together. Okay. They called this mode, of course they denied that they used this methodology. We don't use this methodology, we use good methodology, not this rubbish methodology. This rubbish methodology they described most unkindly as the faggot fallacy, which even my English-speaking students have some difficulty understanding. A faggot is basically an old word for a bunch of twigs, a big bunch of firewood. And the idea was that you have a bunch of weak twigs, well, when you've got a weak bunch of twigs, that's all, nothing stronger. Okay, next. And this case went as far as the US Supreme Court. It's the second of its 3 rulings on scientific testimony. Maybe I should say what they are. Daubert versus Merrill Dow, that's the first ruling on scientific testimony. GE versus Joyner is the second ruling on scientific testimony. And Kumho-Tyre versus Carmichael is the third and the last, so far, Supreme Court case on scientific testimony. Well, the majority is, they're sitting, what are we going to do now? The majority, 5-4 ruling. What are we going to do now? What are we going to do? If we insist on the distinction between methodology and conclusions, it looks as if we're going to have to say Joyner's evidence should have been admitted, right? Because the argument that they used the same methodology is going to oblige us to say this. We don't want to say this. So, well, you know, we talked about methodology versus conclusions in Daubert, but now we've decided there is no real distinction. Ooh, there is no real distinction between methodology and conclusions. Actually, the first time I got interested in scientific testimony in court was in 1997, which was the year that Joyner was before the Supreme Court. A headline in the Wall Street Journal said, "Supreme Court rules that there is no real distinction between methodology and conclusions." You know, imagine an innocent philosopher looking at this. What? You know, this is not a legal question. This is a philosophical question. What do they think they are? A conclave of medieval logicians. Okay, but now I know. They decided we just have to quietly forget this distinction because it's getting us into trouble, so we're going to drop it. And they apparently accepted the defendant's argument. If you put a bunch of weak evidence together, it's a bunch of weak evidence. It doesn't get any stronger by being put together. Okay. Justice Stevens, however, who's now very, very old and one of those who's expected perhaps to retire shortly, an interesting character because he's very unpredictable. He thinks through each case for himself, as far as I can tell, and says things you don't expect. Well, he dissents on this matter. He says, I don't get it. I don't get it. I really don't get what you guys in the majority are talking about. I don't get it. It's not intrinsically unscientific for experienced professionals to arrive at a conclusion by weighing all the available scientific evidence. After all, as Joyner points out, the APA uses the same methodology to assess risks. And indeed, if you look at the Environmental Protection Agency's guidelines for assessing carcinogenicity, as they were in 1986, which was the most recent at the time of Joyner, there is a whole section entitled Weight of Evidence Methodology. So far as I can tell, it contains no weight of evidence methodology. It contains the phrase many times, but no theory about what exactly you're supposed to do. Okay, but it does use the phrase. So, okay, next. This is just my kind of question, right? This is the kind of thing that makes an epistemologist's fingers itch, right? This is really a good question. Can a bunch of pieces of evidence, none sufficient by itself to establish a conclusion to the required degree of proof, do so jointly? Is that a possibility? And if so, when does it do this? Because obviously not any old pile of weak evidence would do this. And why does it do this? Okay, well, this is a really good question. I have an epistemological theory. If the epistemological theory is any good, it will give me an answer, and pray the right answer to this question. Okay, so move on. At the intuitive level, it seems to me that the answer to the question, Can a bunch of evidence, none of it sufficient by itself, establish a conclusion jointly? Is yes. Of course it can. Right? Now, I don't expect you to think that this is obvious because I think it's obvious, but I will give you a number of examples where we take this for granted, but nobody complains what you're doing here is the faggot fallacy. It's just naturally taken for granted. My first example is evidence of early bacterial life on Mars. Okay, there is evidence of early bacteria. When I say early, I mean billions of years ago. Okay. It started with a piece of rock which had been discovered, I believe, in Alaska, but don't quote me on that, and was determined to have come from Mars about 4 billion years ago. Now, you've already got all sorts of intersecting bits of it. How do you determine it comes from Mars and it's 4 billion years old? Well, you heat it and it gives off these gases, and these gases are typical of what you would expect from Martian rock of this age. Right, there's a whole lot of theory involved there. And this rock includes little thingies, little bits, tear-shaped black bits, which are just exactly like fossilized bacterial droppings. Well, one possibility is that it got in the rock while it was in Alaska, right? But they find a way of ruling that out. Another possibility is that it's not actually organic, it's something else, but they managed to rule that out. And then the question is, well, yes, but is this compatible with what we know about the surface of Mars? There can't have been any kind of life without water. And then we discover other evidence that there was. And this just goes, the story is still ongoing. But essentially what you've got, and one of the scientists involved in this actually says it in as many words, is a whole lot of intersecting lines of evidence. None of them by itself would be enough. But if you put them all together, the best story that we can tell is that a long time ago there were bacteria on Mars. Okay. Second example, the evidence that DNA is the genetic material. I take it this is a more familiar example. Right? But if you look even at, suppose you look at the experiments that Oswald Avery did in 1944. Okay. All right. Back up. In 1944, a scientist, Oswald Avery, did a series of experiments which are now taken to have proven that DNA is the genetic material and not protein. Right? And what he basically did was to start with a large quantity of stuff that he knew contained whatever it was that was the genetic material. Extract from it, he started with 20 gallons and he extracted from it, I don't know, a 20th of a gram or something, some tiny amount of the relevant stuff, whatever it was. And then he submitted it to every known test that would distinguish protein from DNA. I think there were altogether 7 of them. Right? So you've got 7 different lines of evidence, all supporting the same conclusion. This stuff is DNA, not protein. Okay. That's now taken as the decisive experiment proving that DNA is the genetic material. Okay. Evidence for evolution. Do I have to keep doing this? There are scads of lines of evidence for evolution, about the age of the Earth, about fossils, about similarities in the bone structure between these late fish and these early reptiles, and so on and so on and so on. If you go to the University of California website, the biology department has a really good page on evolution, one subsection of which is headed lines of evidence, and this goes in 17 different directions, telling you all the different kinds of evidence that together make the theory of evolution so very well warranted. Okay. Or if you prefer, you could think not about scientific evidence, but about historical evidence. I have at home a book called Not Out of Africa, by a historian called Mary Lefkowitz. It was actually an enormously controversial book, which it shouldn't have been. But anyway, it was simply a reply to the claim that the ideas and the artifacts and the philosophy of ancient Greece were stolen from the Egyptians, from North Africa. And she refers to documents written at the time, to theories about how to interpret those documents, to pieces of pottery from that time, etc., etc., etc. Dozens of lines of evidence which together suggest a very strong case for no, this hypothesis about the Greek legacy being stolen from Egypt is false. Okay. All right, so the answer is obviously yes. The next question is, will my theory give us the answer, and will it tell me why? Okay, so I'm going to call on the theory that I first presented in Evidence and Inquiry and then amplified a bit in Defending Science Within Reason, which uses an analogy between the structure of evidence and a crossword puzzle. That, of course, is from the airline's advertisement for what they call the biggest crossword in the world, the crossword of scientific evidence, if I'm right that this is the shape it has, is at least phenomenally, almost inconceivably bigger than that. More difficult question is whether it's even finite, but set that aside for now. It won't affect this argument, I don't think. Okay, next slide. Well, if my theory is correct, how well evidence warrants a claim? I think you would probably say justificar. What did you say?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. Depends on three things. Okay. The first is the supportiveness of the evidence, which is the analogue of how well a crossword entry fits with its clue and with the other entries. Okay. Second is independent security, the analogue of which is how reasonable the entries that intersect with this one and have the right letters in the right places are independent of this one. You can't count this one twice. Right? And then comprehensiveness, how much of the crossword has been completed. Okay, so next. What did you do for say? You'd use the same as me, same letters. Okay. A combination of pieces of evidence, which I will call big E, right, warrants a claim, C, more than any part of it does, if, first of all, if and only if, combining them enhances supportiveness and makes the whole thing more supportive, right, and or enhances the independent security of the favourable evidence. Won't do if it enhances the independent security of the unfavourable evidence, and or enhances comprehensiveness by introducing further and no less supportive elements. Okay, so far this is a simple application of the three factors that I gave you before. Next slide. Now, when you apply this to the sorts of evidence that's typically presented in toxic talk cases, it very much looks as if Judge Terry and Justice Stevens were right, at least in principle. Whether they were right about the particular bunch of evidence in the particular case, that's a separate question, right? And a much more difficult one, and I have my doubts that they were right in either case. But on the principle, they were right. Combined evidence really can warrant a claim to a higher degree than any of the bits do. Okay, now I'm going to run this through a schematic example of with the typical kinds of stuff that you see in a toxic tort case. Toxic tort is a familiar expression to you? Yeah, okay, good. In the US, all the important Supreme Court rulings about scientific testimony come from tort cases. Interestingly enough, in Canada, all the important rulings from the Canadian Supreme Court come from criminal cases. This tells you something really interesting about the difference in the legal and other cultures, I think. Okay. All right, so here's a schematic example. The next one, yeah, okay. I could understand it if I could see it, but I can't see it without twisting my neck. So, okay. Here's the sort of evidence that you might get in a typical toxic tort case. Epidemiological evidence. Is this word familiar to you all? Statistical evidence about the occurrence of a disease in a population or a disorder in a population. Interestingly enough, I had checked the etymology of this word. It comes from epi, which means upon, and demos, which means the people. And so an epidemic is a disease that is visited upon the people. It also has the same root as the word democracy. Who knew? Okay. Who knew? Okay, so that's one kind of thing that you get. Second kind of thing you get is in vitro studies. That means studies in a test tube. Normally exposing cells to a suspected toxin. If you're interested in limb defects in babies, then you'll expose limb bud cells to see whether their growth is suppressed by this stuff, for example. In vivo studies, that means studies in actual animals. And next slide. Evidence about possible biological mechanisms by which this might cause that. Background information about what else is known about possible causes of this disorder or disease. For example, it's known that some proportion, a relatively small proportion, of limb reduction birth defects is heredity. But if that's the case, you can find a family history, right? If you don't find a family history, you can rule out that cause. Okay. And of course, there's relevant chemical, biological theory. Next slide. And then there are meta-analyses of the object-level epidemiological studies, which means, what that means is that a statistician will take a whole bunch of studies, maybe 10, 12, I don't know, and he will essentially submit them to a computer program. The computer program will probably exclude some of them as, there's something wrong with the way they're designed, we're not going to take account of these. So it might be set up so if the disease is self-reported, dump that one. Okay. And then, the machine goes chug, chug, chug. Well, that funny noise a computer makes when it's working, as if there's a mouse in the... Well, they do that, and they end up with a claim about what all the data put together, all the data from all of these different studies put together shows. Okay. This is, of course, a very complicated and difficult process and controversial, because depending on what computer program you use to throw all these things together and then bring out an answer about what they all show, you're throwing in different assumptions. And what assumptions you throw in may make a big difference to the result of the meta-analysis. So meta-analyses are always contested if they come up in court. And then there's, of course, meta-evidence about what's required of good epidemiological, animal, etc. studies. In a good epidemiological study, for example, you don't want all the subjects in the control group to be 10 years older than the subjects in the real group. In the animal studies, it's now standard procedure, if you're using mice, for example, to use mice bred especially for the laboratory, so that there aren't little hereditary quirks in the ones that you You don't use mice you happen to capture about the lab. You use mice you order from a medical supply company. Okay. And then there is evidence about whether the studies to which you're referring were peer-reviewed, whether they were published in good journals or in the journal for people who have to publish something to get tenure. Right? You know, there's always a crappy journal who will take it somewhere down the line. Whether the studies were funded by the manufacturer or whether they were conducted under government grant, and so on. And the next slide. And then you get meta evidence about whether studies funded by manufacturers tend to be more favourable to the product than those funded by somebody else. The answer, by the way, is yes, there is very robust evidence that they do tend to be. And you might have evidence about this particular witness. You know, has he testified in every Benedictine case so far? Or, you know, is he a professional expert witness? One of the witnesses in Joyner, one of Joyner's witnesses, was in big trouble because GE's attorneys, who had a lot of money and a lot of skill, had the wit to ask, you know, how much of your time do you spend testifying in court? How much of your time do you spend actually doing science? And, you know, in your quarters, how many scientific research assistants do you have, and how many paralegals? Well, you know, the answer was I spend 90% of my time testifying, and 99% of my assistants are paralegals, not scientific personnel. Okay, he was not very good for him. Okay, now, this is the sort of stuff that you might have. Okay, next, are we on the next one? Okay. Now, now I'm going to use my theory, apply it to this kind of stuff, and see what happens. Okay. Combining evidence might enhance supportiveness if the conjunction of all the bits of evidence and the conclusion makes a better explanatory account than the conjunction of one bit of evidence and the conclusion, the conjunction of another bit of evidence and the conclusion, and so on. So, next slide. How could that happen? Well, this depends on how tightly the elements of the evidence interlock with each other. If they don't interlock, then it's a pile of weak evidence. If they do, it can enhance supportiveness. How would they interlock? You want the same terms occurring throughout. You don't want, we exposed mice to PCBs and they had heart attacks, as evidence for it was PCBs that gave Mr. Joyner lung cancer. You see what I mean? You want lung cancer to keep reappearing, not different disorders. And the same stuff, not stuff like this, but PCBs, preferably PCBs at this kind of dosage per pound of creature, right? And the interlocking is better the more narrow the terms are. So it's better if it's cancer and cancer than if it's heart attack and cancer, but it's even better if it's small cell lung cancer and small cell lung cancer. This is actually a very distinctive form of lung cancer. It is, by the way, the form most strongly associated with smoking, which was one reason why Mr. Joyner's case was so unclear. He had smoked. Moreover, they interlock more tightly. I'm still just giving examples of ways in which it might interlock tightly. The more like human beings the animals on which the stuff is tested are, right? That's why we never do animal studies on chickens or lizards, right? They're not remotely like human beings, right? The tests that you do in vivo must at least be on mammals, right? Mice or guinea pigs are sort of cheap and easy to handle. Rabbits are more like us, but a bit more expensive and not quite so easy to handle. And the best possible creature would be a primate, a monkey, chimpanzee, something of that kind. But they, of course, are very expensive and very difficult to handle. Okay. But the more like us they are, the more tightly the animal evidence interacts with the epidemiological evidence. You see? Okay. All right, now, these are just examples. Remember it says, for example. Next, independent security. This was the bit I blew the first time round. I got this bit wrong the first time round. Combining evidence can enhance independent security. Now let me make it very clear what I don't mean. If you've got a really bad epidemiological study, right, where the controls were very different from the sample group, and where the records were very poorly kept, and the statistics were very poorly calculated, and etc., etc. Adding good animal studies doesn't make a bad epidemiological study any better. It is what it is, and you add something else, it doesn't get any better. And adding a good epidemiological study doesn't make a badly conducted animal study any better either, and so on through all the combinations. Nevertheless, if you've got an epidemiological study which leads to a certain conclusion, and an animal study that leads to the same conclusion, then the animal studies leading to the same conclusion may make you more sure of the conclusion of the epidemiological study, or vice versa. I think I need an analogy here. This is so hard, and it's so hard it nearly broke my head the first time, so why should you be expected to follow it in 2 minutes? Suppose I'm adding up a long column of figures. Right? I don't suppose anybody does this by hand anymore, but you can imagine doing it, can't you? I'm adding up a long column of figures. While I'm doing it, I'm interrupted. Okay, so I have to hold it in my head while I say, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you now, I'm doing my income tax return, come back next week. Okay.
1 week to the year.
Yeah, right, at least. Yeah, okay, so I'm holding this number in my head and then I keep going and I reach an answer. That is not an ideally conducted calculation, right? I then do it again, right? What I always do is do it again the other way up. And this time I'm not interrupted. And I reach the same answer. Now, the fact that I reached the same answer the second time doesn't make the way I did it the first time any better. Right? I was still interrupted, it doesn't change that fact. But it does make the conclusion more reasonable. Okay, that's what I meant by enhancing independent security. Okay, next one. And combining evidence will also enhance comprehensiveness. That's automatic. You throw some more evidence in, it's more comprehensive. Okay. And that can enhance the warrant of the claim in question, provided that the added evidence is at least as favourable as the stuff you added it to. It won't necessarily do it if it's less favourable. In fact, it will make it less warranted if it's less favourable than what you've already got. But provided it's at least as favourable, it will enhance comprehensiveness. For example, evidence of a statistical association between smoking and lung cancer is enormously enhanced. The comprehensiveness is enormously enhanced if you throw in also, and this is the mechanism by which this stuff in cigarettes damages this part of the DNA and kicks off the cancer growth. Okay. All right, next slide. This is a theoretical analysis. What I just did was applied epistemology. Right? It's not meant to be a set of rules you can apply to determine in any particular case whether or not throwing all this stuff together makes the case jointly. I don't believe there can be any such thing. I think it tells you what to look for, but it doesn't give you a simple procedure to decide. Okay. I looked at what the EPA had under weight of evidence methodology, and it doesn't have a decision procedure either. And indeed, when it rewrote its carcinogenicity rules, it dropped the expression weight of evidence methodology in favour of, God help us, weight of evidence narrative. Obviously been influenced by some fashionable bad philosophy. Right? Never mind. Neither does Bradford Hill. Why am I mentioning Bradford Hill? Can we have the next slide? He's got a face on the next slide. Okay, there he is. Sir Austin Bradford Hill was a British epidemiologist, very famous, very highly regarded. That's why he was a Sir, right? Who wrote a very famous paper in which he offered some criteria, as he said, by which to decide whether or not a statistical association between, say, exposure to this and this disease is likely causal. You understand, a statistical correlation may or may not be causal, right? There's a very high statistical correlation between having yellow-stained fingers and having lung cancer. But having yellow-stained fingers does not cause lung cancer. Okay. It's very important that, first of all, these Bradford Hill criteria only apply when you already have a positive association established epidemiologically. Okay. The list, can we have the list? Is the strength of the association, consistency with other known causal mechanisms, the specificity, that's something like what I meant by saying narrow construction of the terms. Temporality, that's to say the disorder appears after the exposure and not before. Biological gradient, the more you're exposed, the worse the disorder you get. Plausibility, that means does it fit with the rest of what we know about biology? Coherence. Experiment, that means if we take the stuff off the market or we clean up the site, does the incidence of the disorder go down? And analogy. Well, I have nothing against this list. Everything on this list I can actually explain in terms of my theory. I tried to do that in the paper. But I do want to stress very strongly that not only do the Bradford Hill criteria only kick in when you already have favourable epistemological evidence, but also they are not criteria in the sense that he suggests. For one thing, he gives you no clue about, if it scores well on one of these and poorly on another, how do you weight it? Right? Which are the more important? If you have to choose, which are the more important? Doesn't tell you. So it's not a decision procedure, even though attorneys often talk as if it were, and occasionally judges, but more often attorneys. They say, we've got an epidemiological study and I can prove this. They check it all off. But it's not, doesn't work like that. It's indicia is the best word for it. It's a legal term, but that's the best word. All right, with all this apparatus, all this theory in hand, I can actually give answers, my answers, with an epistemological grounding, right, to a bunch of questions which are often contested in court. Okay. First, do you have to have epidemiological evidence of elevated risk to stand a chance of making a case for causation? To which I reply, no. Well-conducted epidemiological studies are a very good thing to have, right? Yes, they are a great thing to have. But enough evidence of other kinds might be sufficient. And that's particularly important in cases like Joiner's, where in the nature of the case there could not be epidemiological evidence, right? The thing was just too rare. Okay. Next. If relevant epidemiological studies find no elevated risk, is this fatal to a claim of causation? To which I answer, yes, but only if they're good epistemological studies, which is why I am very, very unhappy about almost all the epidemiological studies of Bendectin that Merrill Dow presented, because for one thing, not one of them distinguished in the group of women who had taken Bendectin those who took it during the period of pregnancy when the fetal limbs are forming, and those who took it later. Well, the ones who took it later are irrelevant. Right? This was an elementary thing to do if you wanted to find out whether bendectin caused limb defects. Right? And they didn't do it. Okay. Next one. Is it acceptable to demand statistically significant studies and exclude those which are not statistically significant? Judges love the idea of statistical significance because it's, it's clear. Either this study is statistically significant or it's not, and if we can say if it's not, it's inadmissible, our life is a lot easier. Well, sorry, but I disagree. Statistical significance is a matter of degree. Statistical significance is a measure of how likely is it that you got these results by chance. Okay? That is obviously a matter of degree, of more and less. And the point at which scientists the point they routinely pick as, right, if it meets this, it's statistically significant. If it's not, it isn't. Is purely a convention. Right? There is nothing about it, nothing scientific about it. It's just they've decided we will count this as the cutoff point for statistically significant. Moreover, they choose this cutoff point for reasons of their own. Namely, we don't want to exaggerate possible risks. These are not the same concerns as the concerns of an attorney with a plaintiff who thinks he's been damaged by the thing. So I say, no, I'm sorry, the more statistically significant, the more seriously you take the study. But you can't refuse to listen to it at all because it doesn't meet an arbitrary standard of statistical significance. I might say I am not alone in this. Bradford Hill, who was himself an epistemologist, an epidemiologist, used to say, he's dead now, but he used to say, I don't get it. You Americans are obsessed with statistical significance. Don't you understand? It's just a convention. It has no scientific importance. Whatever, we could have set the number anywhere. Okay, so he's with me on this one, or I'm with him, I should say. All right, next question. Is it all right to disregard or exclude animal studies altogether? No, of course not. There's always the question about similarities, right? But such studies can teach you a lot. Actually, there was a lot to be learned from the animal studies of bendectin, which Merrill Dow systematically ignored. For example, a lot of the female rabbits given bendectin miscarried. And one of the reasons for miscarriage is that the fetus is malformed. But they simply didn't include the rabbits who miscarried in the statistics, nor did they study the aborted fetuses to see if they could see if there was anything wrong with them. They were very bad animal studies. I don't like Merrill Dow. Don't like GE much either, but anyway. Okay, next question. Is epidemiological evidence of the doubling of risk essential to proof of causation? This is legally a very important question, because when Daubert went back on remand to the Ninth Circuit from the Supreme Court, Judge Kaczynski, who then wrote the new ruling, used this standard, saying most of the plaintiffs' evidence is irrelevant because they don't even claim to have shown a doubling of risk. Okay, so is a doubling of risk essential? To which I reply, no, it's not. First of all, if you've got a poor study that shows a double risk, all you've got is a low epistemic probability of a high statistical probability. So first of all, it's not sufficient. But secondly, and most importantly, even a good epidemiological study, which doesn't show a doubling of risk in the general population, may actually reveal a more than doubling of risk in some subsample. You know, maybe it doesn't more than double the risk in women in general, but in women who smoke, it does, say, right? Or in women who are pregnant after the age of 40, or whatever, I don't know, I'm making it up. But it could be that there was very good reason to think that your plaintiff's offspring's birth defect was caused by bendectin, even though, in general, it doesn't more than double the risk. And the reason it's so important that the answer to this question is no, is that doubling of risk is a really nice, easy test for judges to apply. And it's gradually taking on something of the appearance of a bright line rule, which is a very, very bad thing, I think. Okay. Next slide. Can we infer from the fact that the causes of this disorder are unknown, and the plaintiff developed this disorder after being exposed to this substance, that it was this exposure that caused the disorder? To which I reply, no. You can talk about inference to the best explanation until you are blue in the face, but the sad fact is we may not know all the possible causes. And I sometimes say to an attorney friend who is very fond of this form of argument, look, Lee, unknown cause is not a cause, right? It means we don't know these other causes, but it's not a class of cause by itself called unknown, right? It's not like heredity. Heredity is one cause, and exposure to this substance is another, and a third is unknown. It's a whole different category of things. Okay, it's very important that there's stuff that we don't know and that we don't even know that we don't know. Next slide. I call this, oh, we went past Mr. Rumsfeld?
No,
Yeah? Okay, so here he is. I call this the Rumsfeld insight. Okay. Whatever you think about Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, I shall say nothing on that subject. I think he might have made a career as an epistemologist, because when he was defending the mistakes that the US intelligence services had made over whether there really were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or not, he made this very interesting epistemological point, that besides the knowns, so the things we knew, there were the unknowns, that's to say the things that we knew that we didn't know, but we couldn't get that information. And there were the unknown unknowns. Right? Now, everybody else in the country said, oh my God, he's senile on top of everything else. What on earth is he talking about? And I was the only person who was not laughing derisively. I was saying, well, you know, he has an epistemological point. One of the things that can get in the way of arriving at the truth is that there is stuff that you don't know is relevant, that you don't know. The stuff that you don't know is relevant, or would be relevant if you had it, we might say. This is also epistemologically interesting because it's in part due to the fact that relevance is not logical, it's material. I'll set that aside for now. So, I think Rumsfeld had a point, and the Rumsfeld insight should actually be taken to heart by attorneys and judges in this kind of case. Okay, now last part of the paper, very short this bit. The legal part of the argument is this. What Daubert does is oblige courts to screen each item of testimony individually for reliability. To determine, this is what Daubert says, the court must determine to a preponderance of the evidence whether it's reliable enough. I haven't the vaguest idea what that means. Like what my punctuation means is, I've been doing epistemology for decades now, and I haven't the vaguest idea what this means. And yet, this is what a judge is asked to determine. Whether, by a preponderance of the evidence, it's reliable enough. Right? This is as bad as the clause in the Texas death penalty statute which says that the jury must be convinced before it hands down a sentence of death that beyond a reasonable doubt there is a possibility that the defendant will be dangerous in future. Beyond a reasonable doubt there is a possibility. Oh my God. Iterated epistemic operators leaving me going, okay. All right, next slide. My argument is not that combining evidence always raises warrant. That wasn't the argument. The argument is that it may do so and sometimes does. But because it may, however you interpret the required standard of proof, and I don't know what it means, but however you interpret it, one little bit of extra evidence might be enough to reach the standard, but might get excluded under Daubert. When, next slide, a feather, just a teeny weeny little bit of extra evidence might be enough to reach the required standard of proof. I tried and tried to get the feather on the scale, but my electronic skills were not sufficient. I'm sorry. Next slide. Some people will say, I don't know why I say that. Ronald Allen will say, I have heard Ronald Allen say, no, you don't understand. Right? What's really going on is that judges who exclude weak evidence are intervening to prevent bad jury decisions. He likes to say they are educating juries. I think educating is a very odd word for withholding information from them, but never mind. To which I want to reply, well, look, in the first place, a judge always has the option, if he believes that a jury verdict is completely mad, that no reasonable person could have found this way on the evidence presented, he is free to enter a judgment NOV, nil obstante verdictum, notwithstanding the verdict. So, if he thinks that the jury has given an award to the Oxendines, for example, not because they've produced good evidence that her damage was caused by bendectin, but because she's just such a sad little girl. You know, it's just so sad to see this poor little deformed kid who will never be normal and who will have a horrible time when she's a teenager. And then he can overturn the jury verdict. Right, so this argument's a bit funny from a simple legal perspective. And in any case, suppose the judge might avert a bad verdict by keeping out weak evidence. Who's to say that the judge is particularly good at knowing when combined evidence really might do the trick? He could prevent the jury from making a good decision by doing this. So, you know, I hesitate to disagree so radically with Ron Allen on a subject which is, after all, his specialty as well as mine, and he's not stupid and he's more legally experienced than I. This still seems to me a bad argument. Sorry. Next slide. Muchas gracias.